Last year in the online bookish community was a time of discourse. In this video, I would like to do a little bit of a reflection, a little after the fact, on those discussions, particularly on politics and books, anti-intellectualism, and why people are no longer reading anymore, because I think that those three topics are very interconnected, and really what I want to do today is to kind of explore the intersection between those three topics. By the way, if you're wondering why the background is different, I'm in Tobago for a few days, and I thought that I would use this opportunity to film this video because I don't know what kind of time or capacity I'll have when I get back home. So I first wanted to start off talking about politics and books. Yes, books are political, and I would offer two, layers of why books are political. The first aspect of it really has to do with the more external factors as to why books are political, and this is to do with stuff like access to reading, literacy, also libraries, and the defunding of libraries that we're seeing happening in places like the United States, or the destruction of libraries and universities that we're seeing in places like Gaza right now. And also something as simple as your individual choice to choose what you spend your money on. So whether you like it, the reality of where you're located, what your wealth or your income looks like, and the choices that you make, all of these realities and choices are political realities and choices. And then on top of all of that, there's just the book banning fiasco that's been going on in the United States, but has been going on forever. Like, books have been banned at a government level, at like a school district level, at maybe just like a school library level. Like, books are being banned and have been being banned at various levels throughout society, throughout history, because hey, some books are dangerous to the status quo, right? And if you want to know a little bit more about book banning, particularly in the context of Florida, I'd really highly recommend that you check out Rachel Reads or Reads with Rachel. The other layer to the politicism, of course, is the actual books themselves and the content. Last year, I read an amazing nonfiction book called Azadi by Arundhati Roy. It's a collection of essays where she reflects on a lot of different things, but she makes a lot of connection between fiction, fascism, and freedom, and that's kind of like sort of the running theme of all of the essays in the book. And in talking about fiction, she talks about fiction as essentially a form of praxis. I don't think she uses those exact words, but she talks about how fiction has historically been a means through which authors can resist, can critique their state, the society around them, and it gives them a level of safety. So anyways, the discussions that have been coming out of the booktube and bookstagram and booktok world about politics and books last year, they were really interesting. When the elections happened, there was this like shock from some people in the bookish online community finding out that some of their favorite creators were either like deliberately not saying anything or not trying to oppose what was going on in the US, as well as the ones who just came out and say, hey, yeah, I'm a Trump supporter, I'm really proud of that, blah, 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 blah. Like, and I'm just over here like, why were you all shocked? Heather from Here Booktubes made an amazing video that I thought was really, really perfect. It was a discussion video where she was like, listen, if I'm looking at what you're reading and I'm not seeing this, that, and the third, then it's very easy to I don't know how you all looked at some of these like orange colored blonde people from Kansas reading nothing but Colleen Hoover and Sarah J. Maas and was shocked that them was Trump supporters. And these were the people who were like adamantly like, anti, politics and books. These were the people who like, we don't want to talk about politics, we don't want to talk about politics and books, we're just here to talk about what books we like, what books we don't like, etc., etc. Like, these are the people who were like pushing this idea, and not just the Trump supporters, but even some of the more like sort of apolitical people. They are the ones who were pushing this idea that books should not be political, and that links to the discussion of anti-intellectualism. Now, I made a whole video about anti-intellectualism last year, so you could go check that out where I talk about it a little bit more in detail. But basically, we need to go back to the definition of the term anti-intellectualism. So anti-intellectualism is not just like, people who don't have the intellectual capacity or anything like that. We all have intellectual capacity, okay? Let's put that out there. As much as we like to pride ourselves sometimes on being smarter than other people, we all have the same capacities. Like, we're all the same species. We're all capable of the same thing, right? And so at the end of the day, like, anti-intellectualism is really about a deliberate and intentional refusal to engage with the world in a critical and intellectual way. It is a difficult thing for people to do because engaging with the world in a critical and intellectual way puts you in a space of discomfort. The conversation around anti-intellectualism and books last year really had to do with the fact that people were either reading books that don't require them to engage with reading in an intellectual way, as well as the fact that people were not putting an intellectual and critical lens onto their reading. So for example, reading The Hunger Games and just thinking like it's a story like about this completely fictional world that has nothing to do with our world, where there's like, you know, this kind of oppressive society that was designed or whatever, as opposed to recognizing that actually The Hunger Games in many ways is an allegory for the world that we live in today. Reading books in an intellectual way, as well as reading books that are literally written for you to engage with it in an intellectual way, or books that are written in a way that are, you know, that's meant to give you a more critical lens on the world. If you're not doing that, it puts you into that box of being an apolitical reader. Again, apoliticism is a myth, but like being a person who's neutral and who's in this box and who's in this safe bubble, who cannot engage with the world critically and intellectually. And that is what the systems at B want. Because at the end of the day, intellectuals, people who are radical, people who oppose the status quo, are considered to be the most dangerous people, and they're made out to be big monsters in the eyes of the powers that be. Think of Arundhati Roy, who I mentioned earlier, who there are like arrests, like warrants out for her arrest in India right now because she's so critical of the very right-wing BJP government that is in power in India right now and has been for some time. I mean, you have people like Assata Shakur, who's like basically a refugee, an American person, but who's like a refugee in Cuba. You have people like Angela Davis, who's been like arrested like every Monday morning for like saying, you know, racism is bad. You have people like Walter Rodney, Claudia Jones, you know, who were made out to be these dangerous people because of the ways in which they criticized the world around them and the ways in which they were very critical of the world around them. The thing about leftist politics and having a critical lens on the world is that that critical lens is often acquired through reading. If you look at some of the biggest, like, you know, leftist intellectuals, you know, people who are progressive and whatnot, if you look at the ones who are actually doing the work, and not just the ones who are performing and pretending, but the ones who've actually done significant work to like criticize the world and try to advocate for a better world, those people are intellectuals. They are readers. Some of them are writers. And if you go around, you talk to like communists and people like that, like, yeah, some of them are probably like, you know, unhinged or whatever, but a lot of them are like coming from a place of reading. They've read a lot, and they've read critically, and they've read widely, and they have a perspective that's very informed. I'm not sitting down here trying to say like I'm a communist or that everybody should now be communist or whatever, but I'm just saying like people who have critical perspectives on the world are people who read, and they don't just read, but they read in a critical way, and they also read books that enhance and equip them with that critical perspective. Intellectualism and critical thinking are a huge threat to the status quo. That's what they are. And the thing about people who are anti-intellectual is that they're also very insecure about being anti-intellectual. They're very insecure about not being able to engage in the world in a critical way, because it puts them in an uncomfortable position, but it also requires work. It also requires honing your critical and intellectual skills. And most people nowadays don't want to do that, right? Which is why people are such a fan of others who are like really like blunt and express their very simple and straightforward opinions in a way that does not want to engage with anybody else. Why do you think Trump is so liked by people in the United States but idiots across the entire world, right? Because he's an idiot. He's a belligerent idiot who relates to most people who are idiots, not because they're not smart or because they don't have the capacity, but because they would rather just live in this bubble of viewing the world in an extremely simple way. So reading in a way that is intentional, in a way that is intellectual, in a way that is critical, is very frowned upon by the status quo. That's why so many books are being banned. That's why intellectuals are, you know, punished by the state. That's why people will make attempts to close educational departments and libraries and stuff like that, because these things foster critical and intellectual thinking, and they foster it through reading. And in general, the system honestly benefits from you either not reading critically or not reading at all. Literally, like the world, the way that the world operates, it benefits from you not engaging in reading in a critical way or just simply not reading at all. And that brings me to the conversation about people not reading anymore, which is a conversation that I will say has existed for a very long time. Like, I feel like as long as reading has been a thing, there have always been discussions about people who read versus people who don't read, and like most people don't read, or at least not that much. But I think recently it's been a bit more of a pervasive discussion because of all of the discussions and the articles coming out about like college students, some of whom are literally doing like English literature as their major, who are not reading and who are not able to read a full book from cover to cover. And at the same time, even if people want to read, of course, they cannot or they do not want to read books that are longer, that are more dense, that are more challenging. They want to read things that are simple, that give them that immediate gratification, right? So there's this bigger discourse going on, obviously, right, that has to do with short form content and how pervasive short form content has become and how short form content has essentially taken away our ability to engage with longer form content, especially reading. And I know that this conversation has a lot of nuance to it. Like, you know, we should not be going around making assumptions as though as if we are qualified psychologists about like, you know, whether or not short form content is like affecting our attention span or our brain chemistry. But I still personally believe that short form content is affecting us. Maybe it's not like changing our brain or our psyche, but it's just getting us to become accustomed to something different. And I think really that's the issue here. It's habit and what you're accustomed to and what you're comfortable with. And it's very difficult to break out of something that you're comfortable with, especially if the thing that you're comfortable with is easier. I've been seeing this a lot too, right? I'm a teacher. I tutor undergraduate students at my university, and I have been noticing like every year they read less and less. They're unable to read as much as they used to the year before. I think sometimes we jump to conclusions as to why students are like that, and I think the first thing people like to say is that they're not as smart as they used to be, and I don't agree with that at all, because every year these students come in and they're very smart, they're very engaged, they're very interested. Obviously there are the few who don't care or who don't want to pay attention or whatever. That's inevitable with any classroom, but for the most part these kids are smart. And something that I found actually is that a lot of them are coming in with more progressive, open-minded values, because that's just the reality of just like new generations and the way that they think. So honestly, it's not that I've lost faith in their intellectual capacity or ability. I just think that what I've noticed personally is a lack of enthusiasm around reading and a lack of willingness to read, because the enthusiasm is not there. The enthusiasm might be there with the topic, but when it comes to the actual like work of sitting down and reading and engaging, that's where it kind of like, you know, dissipates, I suppose. But I also believe that all of this is like honestly a product of, again, a wider system that does not want to foster enthusiasm about learning, right? Because if to feel the enthusiasm to read means to be enthusiastic about learning, and to be enthusiastic about learning means to be passionate about the content. The courses that I teach are very much informed by progressive politics, right? And so like, as much as, you know, the students nowadays and young people could be a little bit more progressive in their values and stuff, it's like a lot of the time it's very surface level. It's not really delving deep into like why these values are important and why the world is the way that it is and why we need to oppose it and change it. It's a kind of like an anemic liberal politics, right? That's becoming very pervasive. And sure, that's better than like outright conservatism, but it still doesn't actually do the job. It carries the veneer of progressiveness without actually being progressive. And I've seen that shift in culture in my university, because the University of the West Indies used to be a really radical space back in the day, from what I understand. And nowadays it's become quite just like, I don't even know how to describe it, like entrepreneurship is like the biggest emphasis. People view education as a means to an end. Like, you go to school, you get your degree so that you could qualify for a job and get money. Like, the first thing people ask students when they tell them about what they're studying in school is like, what are you going to do with that? What do you want to be? What kind of job are you going to have? Like, not, oh, why are you interested in this topic? What is it about gender? What is it about history that you know, makes you, that excites you? We don't ask about learning anymore. Learning is not important anymore when it comes to school and the education system. It's really just a means to an end now, you know? And like, I'm not blaming people for thinking like that, because at the end of the day, if you live in a world where you have to secure yourself by having finances, then that's what you have to do. So you can't be mad at people. But it's the wider system that we have to be critical of, that has turned the institution of education, which is supposed to be something that shapes intellectual thinking, critical thought, turning it from something like that, a place where, students are supposed to be enthusiastic about learning about the world around them, turning it from something like that to tests and examinations and passes and scores and diplomas so that you can have qualifications to get jobs. It should be a combination of both, and a little bit more of the former than the latter, but the reality of the world that we live in, the former is completely neglected and seen as worthless. But that's the thing, we live in a world that does not foster interest or enthusiasm around reading, interest or enthusiasm around critically engaging, interest or enthusiasm around intellectualism and engaging in the world in an intellectual way, because to foster that, to create that, is to create a generation of people who begin to recognize the world for what it is and who will attempt to start changing the world. And to do that is to oppose the powers that be and the status quo. And that is a recipe for disaster. And honestly, based on everything that's been going on in the world, we can see that. We can see that happening in real time. Who knows what's to happen? Maybe there'll be a revolution. I don't want to be a part of it. Please don't conscript me in any army. I would like to stay in my house and watch from afar, as the world begins to descend into disarray, hopefully with the ultimate outcome of fixing itself. And I could, maybe I'll write poetry or do art or contribute in small micro ways, but you ain't gonna see me on the front lines, honey. Ooh, a plane is landing. I could see plane lands from my planes land from my, can you see it? Where is it? There it is. Okay, yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, something about intellectualism. Yeah, so people have been asking what can you do about Palestine? What can we do to contribute and stuff? And yes, there are material things that you could do. You could donate, you could protest, you could, call your representative. I don't know, whatever it is you could do. But honestly, the most powerful thing that I think any of us can do is literally to educate ourselves, right? And you could educate yourself through many different means, but one of the biggest ways through which you can do that is through reading. Not just nonfiction, but through fiction as well, right? Going back to Arundhati Roy, circling back to her, and I guess I'll conclude this video here, right? Fiction is a form of resistance. It can be a means through which writers not just resist, but actually show and illustrate exactly why the world that we live in does not work and why it needs to change. These types of books, even though they're just fiction, they have the power to change you, to allow you to acquire a political perspective that helps you to understand the world for what it is, and that gives you an avenue to help change the world in a way that is positive and in a way that is peaceful and productive and prosperous for everybody. So I don't know, read a book. Before I end this video, I'm going to have a segment where I incorporate your opinions now, because I did a little bit of a community post asking for people to share their thoughts and perspectives on this. Okay, so let's take a look at some of your comments. The Broken Spine says, the whole thought of books and reading not being political baffles me, especially when the existence of marginalized people has always been politicized, and those marginalized people are often writing from shared experiences from within their communities. I often feel that literature is a call to arms, and it's waiting for the reader to step up and carry the torch. I agree 100%, and I think that last line is really indicative of what Arundhati Roy talks about in Azadi. There are always weird reading trends around, and there are always problematic things going on in those hypes, like my fellow commenters have pointed out very eloquently. The thing that gives me an icky feeling is we see so many female-presenting young people being held up as the ones reading the romantasy, and then it gets talked about all the problems with the hype. We're once again back to shaming young girls for their tastes and presenting them as vapid and a bit stupid for choosing the books they read. Regardless of the very real problems, I have a feeling that we should tread very carefully with the assumptions about them and maybe have faith that these young people will eventually find other stuff to read. We all change, and so do our reading tastes. Thank you, Triple Rue. I think this is a really important comment because oftentimes when we have these conversations about genre fiction and the rise of romance and romantasy, it's a lot of cloaked misogyny. And I think it's really important to keep this like in the back of our minds when we're having these discussions, because a lot of the things that we look at as anti-intellectual or not of intellectual value tend to be things that are associated with femininity and womanhood, right? So like the dude bros who are reading all the fantasy books and the Brandon Sanderson and whatnot on booktube, like people are not looking at them, as like these vapid anti-intellectuals or whatever, as the people who are reading all of the romance and the Colleen Hoover and whatnot. And the reality is, some of these men who read a lot of these fantasy books, they are also the kinds of men who might go out and vote for Trump, So let's not act as though as if because, fantasy might be a bit more intellectually stimulating or challenging, that it means that the people who read those books are somehow better than the people who are reading romance. No, that's just misogyny, plain and simple. Ogra left a really long comment, but I think it's a nice comment and you should definitely read it. And it kind of talks about, the importance of reading books that, represent you, but also making space for people who, maybe they're just getting into reading or they're now becoming enthusiastic about reading, and so they're not necessarily prioritizing that. They're just wanting to read what's popular or what seems cool or what works for them in the moment or what seems the most enjoyable. And I thought this was a really good and interesting comment, so definitely go back to the post and read the full thing. Firewood Sparker says, it kind of reminds me of the Twilight hype in my teen years. Romantasy is the genre fiction du jour, and it's getting people reading who otherwise wouldn't, but it's not going to keep them in bookstores once the trend dies down. In my opinion, these kinds of books are anti-intellectual in that they frame themselves as accessible and all other books as inaccessible because they don't require a lot of energy to focus and read. They're fun and sometimes good, but I wish people could see themselves reading past the trend and read more expansively. I agree with this, and I think that to frame books that are not genre fiction as inaccessible is really disingenuous, in the way that, people sort of say I read romance and fantasy and all that kind of stuff because it's more accessible and it's easier to read. Not every literary fiction novel is some kind of difficult to decipher, densely written novel. Some of them are actually as simply written as some of your favorite romance books or romantasy books. It's just that the themes are different, the story is different, the ways in which the characters are written about is different, and so that doesn't make the story less accessible. It might be a little bit difficult to determine, which of the literary books are a little bit more accessible than others, but at the end of the day, most literary novels, I find especially more recently published ones, they're not going to they're not like the classics. They're not going to have you sitting down, spending a whole 10 minutes on one page trying to figure out what is being said. It's readable, it's accessible, and if you're only reading books that are not challenging you, then yeah, read more expansively. I agree. There were a couple other comments, and I can't read them all, but definitely go to the post. There's only about 12 comments, so definitely go to the post and read through the comments, and maybe even add some of your own 2 cents, and, foster community, have a chat, treat it like a little Discord or a Reddit or something. That's going to be it for this video. Actually, I decided to end the video here over this, what would you call this, voiceover or whatnot. The video, for the most part, that you saw a while ago, I filmed literally a month ago when I was in Tobago, and I edited it a week or 2 later, and I just had it sitting down because I kept putting off reading through these comments, and it was a bit chaotic. The video was very much off the top of my head, and I had about an hour's worth of footage, which I managed to cut down to 17-18 minutes. So if you feel like I left anything out, or I was not touching on certain nuances. I probably did, but it just got cut out of the video because I really did not want to post a very long video, plus having to have this section added in. So yeah, if you've made it to the end of the video, I would love if you could leave a light bulb emoji, because we're enlightened on this channel, or any other emoji that you think is appropriate for this discussion. All of that being said, thank you all ever so much for watching this video. Hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.